What's going on, everyone, and welcome into this edition of Philosophical Differences. Brenden Schaeffer, Josh Jacobs of Dealing the Cards with me here. Josh, episode 3, we haven't been canceled yet, probably because we put it out ourselves. That's the beauty of YouTube and podcasts. So make sure you guys subscribe to the Dealing the Cards podcast, subscribe to b-schaeff Daily for the podcast that I put out on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as this YouTube channel. Josh, how are we doing today? Post-trade deadline for the Cardinals. We'll talk about the Cubs loss in a second, but general thoughts on the Cardinals deadline, I think, is the place to start as they pick up Eric Fetty. They pick up Tommy Pham, only having to give up really Tommy Edman to do that move. And then obviously we were waiting to see what would become of Dylan Carlson. He is now a Tampa Bay Ray as the Cardinals pick up a relief arm in exchange for him. What are your general impressions off the top of the Cardinals after the deadline and what John Mozeliak and his crew were able to do?
Yeah, I feel like last time we talked, we were kind of like not sure if they could really do anything. And like, are they going to just do the lateral Tyler Anderson move and random reliever here and call it a day? And the fact that maybe made, I mean, they probably won the deadline in most people's eyes at this point. B, they got creative at the deadline, and you don't usually see them make those complicated moves, right? Like Mosaic likes it to be kind of clean. I don't see him really doing 3-team trades all that often, using Tommy Edman to get that piece. I know they did Bader for Montgomery a while back, but that seems to be more the exception than the rule with them. So I was really impressed with what they were able to pull off, and especially in the market that we saw too. Like, you didn't really see a lot of big names move, so you can't really lament the fact that they didn't go get Scherzer or Eovaldi or guys like that because they just weren't available. So they went out and they got a Fetty, who, I mean, he's not the craziest frontline starter in the world type thing, but he can pitch up to a number 2 if you want him to be. He's probably more of a number 3 type, and sure, maybe he regresses to the back end, but you're paying $7.5 million for that. You got Tommy Pham in the deal too, who just has been electric since he came to St. Louis. And then I'm interested to see what Sean Armstrong looks like. I feel like that's the value of Dylan Carlson at this point. I was hopeful that they could go get a Floro or a Garcia, but clearly the Diamondbacks and I forget who the other team was that went in and got whether it was Garcia or Floro.
Yeah, I don't even remember.
Yeah, but whoever it's
they gave
yeah,
prospects.
and the Cardinals just weren't going to do that. And so the fact that they basically, I mean, they just moved Tommy Edman and Dylan Carlson, got 3 players in return, kept all their minor league depth. I thought it was an A deadline, so I felt really good about it.
Okay, yeah, and look, I thought the A trade was definitely trading a guy that you hadn't used all season because Tommy Edman had been injured. And when were we going to see him in a full-time capacity was kind of hard to say. I'll be kind of curious to see how quickly the Dodgers end up ramping him up. But that's really all you give up to add a piece that you needed for not really only this year, but next year, I think more so when you're talking about Eric Fetty being cost-controlled. And we'll get into kind of how we feel about the organizational starting pitching depth post-trade deadline because some things have changed, obviously. But that was a move that I think made sense for the Cardinals in the short and the long term. And then Tommy Pham, I mean, it hasn't taken long to see why the Cardinals were interested in having not only a guy like Tommy Pham, when you think about the baseball side of it, okay, someone that can hit lefties. This is a team that ranks near the bottom of the league in that category. That's something they could use. But like specifically Tommy Pham, just something about the edge that he brings, I think, is something the Cardinals need. Were you at all surprised based on kind of the past and knowing the whole Tommy Pham aura of it all that the Cardinals and John Mozeliak were willing to say, no, we don't have a problem with Tommy coming back. In fact, Mo, one of the quotes that I heard on the radio that I thought was funny, he said, that's our man Pham. I mean, was this really what we expected the Cardinals to feel about Tommy Pham? Maybe not, but I think everybody's glad at this point in understanding of why they did that and feels fortunate that they did take the plunge, bring Tommy back, and have that reunion.
Yeah, it feels like whenever that name was brought up to anyone, I mean, yourself or anyone who's kind of following around the team, it kind of felt like, yeah, I mean, it makes sense as a fit wise, but the Cardinals, they want to do Tommy Pham, right? They'd go after Kevin Pillar or whoever it is. So to see how candidly they wanted it and for them to agree to an Edman for Fetty trade, but then to be willing to expand it out and get it complicated and make it a multi-day process so they could get Tommy Pham into the deal. I was really impressed by that. And clearly there's players in the clubhouse who wanted him. He seems like an Ollie guy. Like, I think Ollie's going to eat up having him on the team. Mo seemed to be interested in it. I don't know. Like, I don't know the full context. I don't know if maybe it just took some time and now they're fine with it, or they just realize they need that kind of energy in their clubhouse. And then it was interesting when the trade went down, it was pretty mixed reviews, Cardinal fan wise. You had some that were really excited to get Tommy Pham and others who just don't like the personality. But it literally took one at bat for that to change. Everyone's all in on Tommy Pham now. I don't see anyone complaining about it. And he seriously is there wasn't like a game changing bat out there, but he's the he approximates the most value you could have hoped for in acquiring a bat for this lineup. The way he fits into it, the ability he can have coming off the bench late in games, like he did at that grand slam. Now he's not going to do that every time, but you've got that threat of the start against left-handed pitching. Yeah, I just was really impressed that they did it. So when it came through, I was happily surprised. It seemed like a good fit, but just didn't seem like a cardinal move.
Yeah, and I think when you think about that, the process of, okay, we're going to trade Tommy Edman, we're the Cardinals, we're comfortable with that, we're going to get Eric Fetty back, and to figure out a way to finagle the rest of that deal. Now, of course, the Cardinals weren't going to trade Edman to the White Sox. There was some kind of confusion about the way that was explained, because Mozeliak did have a quote where he said we had the Edman for Fetty part down, but that still would have involved the Dodgers, because the Dodgers were who wanted Edman the entire time. So that was the context that might have been missing for people who heard that quote or saw it on Twitter explained in a certain way. But to be able to kind of hold the line on, well, Mo said, well, it took longer than we thought it would, but I think the whole time they did have in mind, find a way to get Tommy Pham here. And maybe what happened at the end of the deal is that they did give up the 17-year-old prospect from the Dominican Summer League, and he goes to the Dodgers, because the Dodgers were sort of supplying all the prospects to the White Sox, who had the other piece the Cardinals wanted to pick up. And so I think that's maybe where some of that involvement, if I'm just reading tea leaves on the way that the trade went down. But certainly Tommy Pham, I think, is everything that you'd want for the clubhouse. He's talked about trying to work his way into an everyday role. He doesn't accept the platoon label. He's going to go out there and he wants to play. And look, if the performance is there, I don't think Ollie and the Cardinals are going to have an issue with it. He had another multi-hit game yesterday. As we're recording this on Friday morning, you may be listening after the Cardinals-Cubs game on Friday, and that's okay, which is why we're not going to spend too much time like predicting the Eric Fetty start for Friday. But generally, we think he's going to slot into the rotation pretty nicely. You mentioned it a little bit, Josh, but number 2, number 3, regardless of what it is, do you think that Fetty could be a good fit for this Cardinals team? Obviously, comes back from Korea, almost a different pitcher. I think for Cardinals fans, that look, if you just inherently pull up his baseball reference page and say, oh, I mean, my goodness, this guy was a 5.5 ERA. No wonder he had to kind of take that year in Korea, but has come back and, adds a pitch and ends up being somebody that has been effective and consistent throughout the season. Again, you can offer a prediction if you want. People may be watching already knowing what happens. I expect Fetty's going to acclimate himself, hopefully pretty nicely for the Cardinals on Friday afternoon at Wrigley. What a way to enter yourself into the Cardinal organization by having a matinee businessman special on Friday at Wrigley Field. But just generally a little bit more on Fetty and kind of the way that you think he could fit in for the Cardinals.
Yeah, and I don't know if we talked about it last time, but I remember saying it to someone that he feels like what Miles Michaelis was when he was an all-star, right? Where it's like it's a better swing and miss than Michaelis has now. So like when you say Miles Michaelis, everyone thinks this Miles Michaelis, but he was an all-star in, what was it, 2018, I think. And 2022 is really good as well, an all-star as well. Like it feels like Fetty could be that kind of pitcher where not everything is about swing and miss. Swing and miss is important, but it's not the end all be all. If you don't have it, you can't pitch in this league. It seems like Eric Fetty's figured it out. He gets enough swing and miss to get by. That sweeper is incredible that he's added to his arsenal. And it's like most pitchers, you should take their track record into account. And it's not that you can completely forget that Eric Fetty was a terrible pitcher in his first stint of things, but he was a first-round pick, a highly touted prospect. He went overseas and he basically changed who he was. And so it's kind of hard to compare him to his old self, because there are some pitchers like a Tyler Anderson where some years he just gets better results with the same stuff. And that's not who Eric Fetty is now. It's for all intents and purposes, he's a different guy. So I think I expect him down the stretch to be very similar to what Jordan Montgomery, Jose Quintana were in 2022 when they acquired him, where initially you don't necessarily have the high. Well, I think people have higher expectations for an Eric Fetty than they did Montgomery or Jose Quintana, but Quintana had like a 2.10 ERA or something like that. And then Montgomery was really solid and then came back and was really good the next year for the Cardinals in 2023. That's the style of pitcher I expect Fetty to be, where if he goes up against Aaron Nola in a game 2 against like the Phillies, I feel pretty good about Eric Fetty going against him. I think Aaron Nola is the better pitcher, but it doesn't mean Eric Fetty can't hold his own in a start like that. I think the margin for error for a guy like Fetty is smaller, right? When you rely on the defense behind you, but considering he had an awful defense behind him in Chicago and was playing for a team that's on pace to be the worst team in baseball history, and he was producing like he is, I'm going to tend to believe he's going to at least be within the same kind of production with the Cardinals, if not get better. It's hard for him to get better than he's been this year, but I just don't have, I have a lot of confidence in Fetty going into games. Now, again, if he's matched up against the best starters in baseball, I'm still going to take those guys over him. But I think he can approximate the value. He can get you those 5 or 6 innings. And then especially in the regular season, I mean, I think he's a guy that's going to go deep in the ball games, help that bullpen out. Hopefully Sonny Gray. I mean, Sonny Gray looked pretty good yesterday. It wasn't his best start of the year, but it was a lot better than it's been recently. If you can have like a Gray, Fetty at the top, and then the trickle down effect of Gibson's now your number 3, Palante's in there instead of Lynn for I don't know how long Lynn's going to be out here. And Michaelis is really like your 5th starter right now. I think this is more the rotation you really want to see for a contending type team. When it seemed like there were some stretches where the rotation would figure it out, but then it inevitably would crack and you could feel the difference of not having that number 2, number 3 type like Fetty. So I think Cardinal fans are very quickly going to see what it means to have Gray and Fetty go back to back and starts and be able to expect to win those 2 games or expect the bullpen not to be used up and dried out in those games, and to see the trickle down where you're able to be more creative in a Michaelis start, a Gibson start, a Palante start as needed.
Yeah, and I think too, the Cardinals are not guaranteed to make the postseason. They've still got some work to do and a ways to go. But when we were sort of having the conversations about what it could look like to add a number 2, you only play this wild card series once. Let's take a hypothetical leap here and say the Cardinals are in one. You only get to play it once, but you also only have to play it once. So it's not like Eric Fetty has to be better than the number 2 that you're going to face from another team. He just has to match him up on that day, get through the lineup a couple of times and give up a run or 2, keep the Cardinals in the game. Hopefully the Cardinals have a big swing or they're able to have one rally in those first 6 innings that scores them a couple runs. And then you leave it up to the bullpens, which, the Cardinals didn't add a ton in terms of the bullpen at the deadline. They pick up Sean Armstrong. They didn't make a separate deal from getting rid of Dylan Carlson. Like, that's the move we knew was coming. We told you was coming, but was there going to be another one where they maybe give up a prospect and really dive into the relief market as it was, where you're giving up top 100 names, you're giving up genuine pieces to pick up elite relievers, especially guys that have team control attached. And the Cardinals didn't go to that level. I do think we've seen a better version of Jojo Romero the last couple of times out. Perhaps that could be helpful. Andrew Kittredge has had some time off. Is that going to allow him to be fresh for the stretch run? Yeah, the Cardinals are going to rely upon the bullpen, but I kind of look at it and say there's a world in which a 2 out of 3 Sonny shoves, like you get the 10 strikeout, 7-inning shutout performance from Sonny in a game 1. And again, it may not happen, but it only has to happen one time.
Yeah.
If out of 50 times you'd say he's going to be mediocre half the time, because that's kind of what's been the case for him recently for the Cardinals in the regular season, just needs to be great that once. And then Fetty needs to do kind of the Quintana start from game 2 in 2022 and or game 1 in 2022. And then if he gives you that and you don't blow the save, then maybe the Cardinals are moving on to an NLDS. Yes, they have to get there first. No, we're not counting the chickens before they hatch, but it is fun to think about process when it comes to those kinds of conversations. I do think that's your 1-2 as long as everything goes to plan if you get into a wild card series. But let's talk about the bullpen, because while others in the bullpen have maybe picked up their game in recent weeks, Ryan Helsley obviously has the blown save last night. As we're recording this Friday, we're talking about Thursday night's game. That was the first time, though, all season that Ryan Helsley enters with a lead in the 9th inning and the Cardinals lose the game. The other blown saves he had, he ended up as the winning pitcher in the game because he pitched another inning after the offense had done their job, or he just kind of got lucky. And the first game against the Dodgers where he blew that save, didn't pitch well that night, but finished the inning, and the Cardinals immediately scored. Did Gio get that save? Who was the guy that got the save that day? I'm trying to remember. It was the first series of the season. I want to say it was Gallegos, but I'd have to go back and look at that. But nevertheless, thoughts on Helsley right now, because there's so many kind of layers to this, in my opinion, when you know that the first time he faced the Cubs, it was like that Memorial Day weekend series at Busch, and suddenly that was the first tip of, hey, something's going on with the fastball. Either he's not trusting and commanding it, or you could take it to the next step and say the Cubs know something about when it's going to arrive. And if he's tipping, the Cubs are in on that. The Cardinals have downplayed the notion of tipping, acknowledged there was something small maybe going on, but that it was long since fixed. And the issues since then with Helsley's fastball has been more of a confidence thing, just something separate that he's working through, whether that's mechanical. Anytime there's something like that going on, they're going to be vague. But they wanted to separate that out and say it's not a tipping issue anymore. Yeah, maybe there was something kind of there. Okay, let's move on from that. But is there something else he's working through? But last night, he has been pitching backwards. And in the Swanson at bat was a key example of that, where he throws him only sliders. I think he's got a very good slider, and so he's been able to get away with it for a while and has not blown saves during the stretch very much. when this has happened. But last night was a situation where throws a bad slider to Dansby. The fifth one ends up being a bad one, and he's able to put good wood on it. And from there, things kind of devolve. What's your take generally on how much the sky is falling from one loss versus just tell me your thoughts on kind of how that came to be last night, your general thoughts on Helsley. He's been so good for so long. But yeah, last night he did cost him the game, but that's not to say that, he's all the things I'm seeing kind of on Twitter from people about Helsley and making these big sweeping generalizations. He can cost them one game because let's be honest, they win the game if he does his normal job. But
yeah,
he's also a person that's not a robotic baseball machine and has a 2.7 ERA even after last night.
Yeah, I mean, I think we got spoiled. His first opportunity as a closer, he had an all-timer. He was incredible that year, and so you expect him to just be dominant every single time out. I still have full confidence in Ryan Helsley. Now, am I a little bit like I'm like walking on eggshells? It feels like with him a little bit sometimes, yeah. But I trust his stuff. I know he doesn't trust his fastball right now. It seems like,
Right.
but I still think it's a really good pitch, and I'm gonna bank that he's gonna figure that out at some point. That slider plays even when the fastball's not. 2.7 ERA. I think it's really easy when you watch a guy make his saves every single time to start poking holes in his game and to feel like he's not good enough. And I feel like a lot of teams probably feel like that about their closers sometimes. I mean, go look at the Chicago Cubs. If you want to talk about a team that does not know how to shut down games, the Cubs would be a playoff team if they knew how, at least earlier in the season, if they knew how to shut down games. And so
Yeah.
I think we're overly critical of the Cardinals bullpen a lot of time, especially because they have to play so many of these close games where it's like it really does feel like it hinges on Ryan Helsley being good every single time for them to win the game. And so when he's not, it feels like it's his fault. This guy's falling. And I know the Cardinals put 4 runs last night, but come on, can they start putting it 5, 6 more consistently? It was Shota though, so like I'm gonna give him grace on that. And it's a left-handed starter. Like I was more impressed last night than I was pessimistic about the offense. He left some hanging sliders out there or hanging curveballs, and it just wasn't a really great. It wasn't a great outing. But in general, I think Ryan Helsley's been good this year. I'm curious if you feel like the sky's falling with him, but I've seen those takes on Twitter, people being like they should have gotten the haul for Ryan Helsley. It's proven it. I'm like, okay, like this guy has been nails this year. He was an all-star. I know it hasn't been as good as of late, but I still feel good about him at the back end of games. And that maybe he just needs to stop pitching against the Cubs. Like maybe they just have his number. I would be curious to see what his numbers are against everyone else in baseball versus the Cubs.
That is a good question, and I'll maybe try to have some time later to look that up. But yeah, I don't think the sky is falling. I do think it's fair to be like aware of Ryan Helsley's issues with the fastball because he for the longest time when he had the save streak, he was getting away with it, pitching backwards, which is like it's cool for a little while, but you also need to be able to establish the fastball. His slider is so good. It's the better pitch. I get it. He throws 100. His slider, in my opinion, and I've said this, is his best pitch. That doesn't mean you can necessarily just throw it over and over and over because eventually guys like Swanson are going to be able to key in on it. And look, I do want to ask this part of it because I understand both sides. I really do. But I also know the job that Ollie Marmol has in the moment where he had to make this decision. And I ultimately I'm on his side. Like, I think he did the thing that he has to do. But I also was sitting there thinking, as they're challenging that play at second base on the stolen base attempt, he was the runner beat the throw. He was going to be safe. But replay era, Brenden Donovan held the tag. And when you hold the tag on a runner, if there is even a micro millimeter of he's off the base, they're going to give you that out now, and you cannot take the replay review with you. And so for all those reasons, I think it made sense that Ollie Marmol, I think he had to challenge. So this is not me being critical of Ollie Marmol. And also, he's listening to the guys in his replay review room telling him, here's what you do. And then he goes earphones because he's not seeing the video himself. So I think as a general philosophy, that's right. Last night, it was interesting. It was raining. So part of me was like, if it pours down unholy right now, and there's a delay in the middle of this AB because that didn't end up happening, but like that's kind of running through my mind. And then specific to the way that the inning was unfolding, the first 2 sliders to Dansby were nasty. I mean, it seemed like he was on top of them and put him right where he wanted him. Dansby probably swings over a third slider if you just get him the ball right back. What are your thoughts on that? Just understanding that, yes, it was something where maybe Helsley gets a little bit, he's not as sharp ready into the moment of the game after a 2-minute delay, but also having context. And look, I think baseball fans largely are smart and understand, let's not just overreact to one little thing. This is a cool baseball moment that I actually think is fun to talk about. It didn't work out for the Cardinals, but like this notion of the obvious thing is if you can steal an out right now and win the game, do it. But also Helsley probably could bake one more slider in there and the game could be over as well. But it's a one-run game, so if it's a base hit by Dansby, you're going, why didn't that moron challenge? They could have had a chance to end the game. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on that just generally?
I think it's a really interesting thing to think about, but I still think you go with the challenge because you can make a perfect pitch and he puts the bat on the ball, gets lucky, it bloops into left field, and they score the run anyways. And it's like, well, Helsley did everything he needed to do there, and they scored the run. So I'd rather try and get that out there. But I think you're spot on, especially with the weather right there, and then also it just delays Helsley more. So he's got to be thinking, and who knows, maybe that calms him down. Like sometimes you give him a little bit of space here, take a breather, get back in this at bat. But like you said, those two pitches beforehand look pretty good. So I think it's an interesting thought, but it's not necessarily something that, and you weren't doing this either, but I would retroactively go back and say Ollie messed up there. It would have been interesting to see the go the other route, but I think people would have been more upset if he didn't do that, right? Like I think if they're like you said, you moron, why didn't you challenge that call? But yeah, I didn't think about that in the moment, but as you bring that up, I'm like, yeah, I could see why that would be an interesting thing. I guess, something that I've been curious about a little bit is it feels like the Cardinals have been this year of all years, like it feels like instructing their relievers to throw their best pitch more often and kind of rely on that slider and that changeup. Do you think that's something that's happening with Helsley, where it's like we look at Helsley like, why aren't you throwing your fastball, idiot? You've got a 102 up your alley here. You're not throwing it. But do you think it might be a little bit more of a Cardinal philosophy to rely on that slider more? Am I overthinking it a little bit?
I think it might be more specific to Helsley just because of the lack of confidence in the command of his fastball. And like he's missed it when he misses, it's kind of been like up arm side.
Yeah.
And that's sort of been a consistent. So it makes me wonder if it's mechanical at times, but it's something where he might fix it for a game, but then slip back into it. And so that to me, that's what it is. And it's this notion of like, Ryan, don't be afraid to throw your slider because you have a nasty one. So I think for him, that's probably more what it is. But when you think about 2023 and the way the season went wrong for the Cardinals and the number of two-strike pitches that were non-competitive because of how middle they really were, I like that could be a philosophy of the Cardinals to be like, hey, let's not give an inch. Don't give anything away, especially when you are in the pitcher's count. You're in the position to be able to make a guy wonder what's coming and oh, is he really going to throw that pitch in that count? Like, yeah, man, don't be afraid to throw your best pitches more often, I think is probably something the Cardinals have leaned into, and I don't really disagree with that at all. Is it specific to Helsley why that's happening? I don't know. He's definitely thrown the curveball less frequently, and I think last night, at least per Statcast, he threw one curve. And of course, it was the one that Bellinger hit out.
Yeah.
And so that's maybe part of the reason is like, look, man, when you've got two pitches that play the way that Helsley's do you need to show him the curve? Because what happens if you leave it in the zone? Like for me, if Helsley's going to do it, it's going to need to be in a particular situation and it's not in the strike zone. Like I don't really need him to hang one in the strike zone because even if it is located where he wanted it, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a better option than his fastball well located or than his slider that just starts out at the knees and it's 6 or 8 inches below the knees by the time it gets to the plate. And that's something that just with the spin on it, batters just can't do anything with. So you really like that. Back on the situation, though, with Ollie, I was interested to get your perspective with that. To circle on that, and you mentioned it, like when it comes to fans are going to probably get mad if it goes the other way and he doesn't challenge. But the extension you have to make on that is in a world in which he doesn't challenge, but then we at home get to see the replay, and let's say we do see a sliver and he's out. It's easy to say after the fact that, no, of course we're not mad because we watched the replay and he was safe. Okay, but Ollie doesn't get to see the replay. Ollie's got his guys that are looking at it who only might get to look at it once or twice and speed it back up and slow it back down. And then they have to make a decision and move on when it's typically a situation that doesn't cost you anything because you can't take it with you when it comes to this extra replay review at the end. You might as well use it. It can be very difficult to put ourselves in the position of what the manager and the coaching staff is actually facing in a moment because we can't trick our brains into not having the benefit of hindsight because it's all we are used to at home. We're like, well, how did they not know? We can see it right there. Well, keep in mind, he doesn't have an iPad in the dugout that he can go ahead and look at it real quick and give him the signal of what needs to happen. So, and this was similar a week or two ago when I had a chance to ask Ollie Marmol about the moment from what was it last Friday night when they played the extra inning game against the Nationals, and it was the intentional walk. Should they have pitched to Luis Garcia, who ultimately like had really good splits and great numbers in that spot? But my wondering was, and a lot of Cardinals fans and even people in the press box at the time were wondering about this, was like, all right, even if you give up a hit to Garcia that gives the Nationals a run, you've got a guy on second, so maybe you can tie and extend the game. But then you play that out further. Nationals still have Kyle Finnegan. Cardinals already had used Ryan Helsley, and so you don't really want to play to get to an 11th. And ultimately, even though I was skeptical in the moment after hearing all this explanation, I was on the fence, and I moved to the side of, yeah, he probably ends up doing the right thing in that. But one thing he told me during that conversation, as I was explaining, I said, yeah, this morning I was kind of thinking through, and he said, well, I only had 30 seconds to think through it. Like, I don't get the benefit of, now we know the result, and here's what you could have gone back and done.
Yeah.
If I were a manager, man, I would feel very much a certain way about everybody having an opinion on those things. That it's great for you to be able to talk about it and think through it for a couple of hours, but to not have that benefit, that's the guy that's in that seat in the dugout. And so I just wanted to throw that out there as more of a general thought process. If he doesn't really get to do, and it's not just an Ollie thing, it's every big league manager. And I've always said, for that reason, Cardinals fans will hate on anybody that's in the manager's seat, because Cardinals fans are passionate. And I think we do have that inability as a society to disconnect of, oh, they didn't get to perceive this moment the way that I did. I had more time to think about it and talk about it from my couch. That's just if you want to respond to that, you can. I just wanted to kind of loop back to that. Your question about Helsley was good. I just had to steamroll through it after I answered it, because I was like, this is something that's kind of been on my mind.
No, that's great. And at the very least, it's a good thought process to think through. And it doesn't mean people can't be critical of decisions, but it helps at least to be like, I think people know they have hindsight sometimes, but they say that and then still get overly critical and
It's hard.
Yeah, it's a hard balance. Like you said, it's impossible for us not to think like that, but it's helpful when Ollie can be candid like that. And I just don't like when people get frustrated at Ollie or Mozeliak or people like that for being honest about the human factor of baseball. It doesn't mean they did the right thing, but I think we also need to remember that if you're in that seat in that moment, you're going to make mistakes too. There's no such thing as a perfect manager. No one's going to make every right move. And a lot of times they have good process with it. I think where we should be critical is when there's bad process that leads to bad results. Good process that leads to bad results, that's going to happen. It's a game.
Yeah, and look, last night, to me, good process of Ryan Helsley's your it's not even a good process. It's the only process.
Yeah.
I had people telling me John King should have come in to face Talkman, and I'm like, I respectfully, that opinion, what's the line from Talladega Nights? Ain't worth a velvet painting of a whale and a dolphin getting it on. It's just not the way it works. If you go into Ollie's office and say, why not John King for Talkman? It's probably the last time that you feel compelled to walk in there, because you're walking out with the tail between your legs. So it's, again, that is just one of those things that I can tell you. You can choose to believe me out there in Cardinals land or not, but I cannot spend much more of my emotional energy explaining why Ryan Helsley, your all-star closer, is going to be seen through that spot. The one moment in history where I will give you that there might have been a moment a little bit earlier to take Ryan Helsley out of a game in the ninth was that wild card series in 2022, but only because of the context of what had happened in Pittsburgh a few days earlier with the finger, and you wonder, did it numb up on him, which ended up being the case. But in the moment, do you know that, and how soon do you know that into the outing? Is that something that you're thinking about? I can remember asking Ollie Marmol the next day about, like, is that something? And he's like, look, I'm going to go to sleep at night knowing that if I'm going to go down, I'm going down with Ryan Helsley, who that season was just out of his mind brilliant. So that's sort of, as much as it can be like, oh, duh, why would you? He's giving up hits. You should take him. He's Ryan Helsley, guys. Like, this is, and two, to the people that would say they should have traded him and gotten a haul, I understand it. And there are GMs out there of other fan bases that might be the way that they operate. We know that's not the way that the St. Louis Cardinals are going to operate. I think MLB The Show and Out of the Park Baseball are kind of breaking our brains a little bit, because it feels like the Cardinals have been burned by this thing before with, like, a guy like Alex Reyes, and they're not. That also comes from the portion of the fan base that doesn't see the playoffs this year as a possibility. But I'll tell you, over the past 3-4 years, the times that they've made it, there have been those moments where you could have done the same similar things, but the Cardinals actually make good deadline moves, and they buy a little bit, and they buy marginally, and it was enough to get them in. Now, what's the value of losing to the Dodgers in a wild card game, and Reyes gives up the walk-off? I get it, but at the end of the day, that's hindsight based as well, because maybe they win that wild card game, and then if they go on to an NLDS at least, or even beyond that to an LCS, nobody's going, oh man, they really should have traded Reyes. No, you have the memories of that playoff run, but you don't get to know until it's over what the result of it was. And so that's sort of that's my soapbox. I'll get off it to ask a question to you, Josh, that you wanted to touch on coming into the podcast, and I think it's interesting. What do we think about the Cardinals starting rotation depth, not just this year, but I really want to focus more on 2025 and how they could handle the winter. Draw me up your vision of a 2025 rotation. Who's on the team that you feel like, hey, this guy actually factors in now? Maybe Michael McGreevy joins the conversation in a way that we didn't think he would prior to his 7 innings the other day. What do you view as the Cardinals starting pitching situation? And then maybe what does that leave them and John Mozeliak to need in the offseason? Because that's why Fedde, to me, was so important. $7.5 million, cost controlled. Maybe salary and payroll is something that we maybe are going to talk about more than we wish we had to if DeWitt is going to limit what they're going to be able to do on that front. But how do you kind of view it now that they've added Fedde, now that we see Lance Lynn, a little balky with the knee, probably wasn't looking to pick up his option anyway, but now maybe even more so. But is a guy like McGreevy into your mindset, just generally speaking on the rotation as it views toward 2025?
Yeah, let's thumb through the names because I think it's pretty safe to say Gray, Fedde. I feel like they're going to pick up that Gibson option. That seems like a lock at this point. And then
Okay.
Michaelis, I don't think he's moving either. That's 4
There you go.
guys right there.
Yeah.
And so then you have Mats, but also an expiring 12 and a half. I don't think it's impossible to move. And so I think, could you maybe move that money? I don't know. It's hard for me to know what that looks like. But do you need to rely on Mats? I don't think you need to. Could decline the 12 million on Lance Lynn? I think you could at this point because now you've got Palante. I'm going to throw Zach Thompson in there because you never know what an offseason could do for him, but he's at least a body that maybe could work out.
Is he above or below McGreevy right now in your pecking order, Zach Thompson?
I mean, recency bias would make me say below for sure.
It would. I will say I would have probably. I'm not trying to count him out, but I'm kind of counting out Zach Thompson based on, and maybe that's not fair. I like Zach a lot.
Yeah.
I just think he's another. I kind of thought trade him at the deadline, and maybe he's been kind of off and on injured all year. I don't know if there was any interest in him, but I thought change of scenery for him could be something because to me he's not really in the pecking order. But to be fair, you bring up recency bias because McGreevy was not on anybody's radar to be a big league starter, except for maybe Michael McGreevy because of what we've seen from him in the minors, not really missing a lot of bats. That was just, we feel like he's Dakota Hudson 2.0, and that's not something that the Cardinals should be inviting back into their rotation. That was the general public speaking. Yeah. I've always liked McGreevy's moxie. I've always like in spring, I've watched him. I'm like, this guy carries himself. And I do think when you saw him, mound presence is something that's very hard to quantify. I liked the mound presence and the general look of the way McGreevy attacked the outing he had. It's one game, so we have to be careful with that. I know I cut you off, but that I just wanted to kind of throw some McGreevy thoughts out there. And you mentioned Zach. You've got McGreevy in there. Let me know more about what you think of him and anybody else you might want to consider for. I'm talking like to begin 2025. We can have all the Quinn Matthews and Tin Ken's conversations we want. If you think those guys are going to be day one ready, say so. But I'm kind of wondering if maybe those guys are more toward like earliest would be mid-season of 2025.
That's how I feel about it too. And I think it's setting them up for failure to pencil them into the 2025 rotation or to even be the next man up. So here's where you have to follow the train of thought a little bit, but I think Gray, Fedde, Gibson, Michaelis. Going into last offseason, they had Michaelis and Mats. So you had a guy that's got injured every single year, and you had a guy coming off a really down year in your rotation. Now you've got your ace in Sonny Gray. People can debate that, but a frontline guy in Sonny Gray. You've got Fedde, who, if you call him a 3, that's fine, but that's a really cheap number 3 starter, considering Miles Michaelis is making $17.5 million to be your number 5 starter. You've got Gibson and Michaelis. I think what this allows you to do is to potentially take a risk on a Nathan Eovaldi type in free agency, whether it's that name or the guy that could profile like that, where in past off seasons, even we can critique what arms the Cardinals have gone after in free agency, but to their point, it's hard to go out and sign a guy that you're worried about injury risk about. You're worried about the high end outcomes is he's a number 2 starter. The low end outcome is he's a 5.5 ERA guy who's just awful, which, I mean, they've gotten some veterans like that too, but you're paying up for it if you're in that Eovaldi range. If you have a Palante as your 5th man or your 6th man up, and then McGreevy's your 7th man up, and then Graceffo's your 8th man up, and Liberatore is your 9th man up, like, you can start to convince me that, hey, if a couple injuries to this rotation happen, they'll be okay for a 10-start stretch to have Palante in there. They'll be more than okay to have Palante in there. They'll be okay for a 10-start stretch to have a McGreevy in there. Why not go out and make that bigger addition? It could be even a trade. Maybe they take one of these young bats and they say, hey, we're going to go all in on one of these pitchers now and see what happens. And even if they ran into the season with Gray, Fedde, Gibson, Michaelis, and Palante, I feel pretty good about the fact that McGreevy's your next man up, Graceffo, Liberatore, and then hopefully by mid-season of 2025, one of Tin Ken's, Quinn Matthews, maybe it's a Cooper Jerp you can factor into the rotation as well. You do have Michaelis and Matz's money coming off the books, and then also Gibson and Fetty as well after 2025. So you kind of need to replenish that group anyways. And I don't think you can just say 2026 will be the Hence Jerpy Matthews show either. I think
I hope so.
I hope so, but that should be gravy on it and icing
Yeah.
on the cake, not like this is our plan. But I'm personally starting to convince myself, and maybe it's dangerous territory because I don't know if the Cardinals will operate like this. But since 2021, what percentage of the Cardinal starts do you think have come from guys they've developed?
Oh, very low number. I mean, does it count now? When you say developed, does like Liberatore count?
Liberatore. So I put people who are like, I didn't count Adam Wainwright and Lance Lynn because they're free agent contracts. So guys that are pre-arb or arbitration guys. So they could have acquired them, traded for them. So I even counted those guys in. So it'd be a lower number if I didn't count Liberatore in.
I'll let you give me the answer, but I'm not going to expect a very high because I'm thinking of the names themselves. Liberatore, I guess Zach has made a few starts. Who else has started some games that would Palante obviously would qualify.
Yeah.
Who am I missing? There's probably not that many other names.
There's a name. The best name they've had is going to surprise you, but 37% of their starts have come from guys that have come from within. Of that group of homegrown talent, only 2 guys have had 10 or more starts with an ERA lower than 4.
It's got to be Palante. It's got to be one of them.
So Palante's one of them, and then John Gant is the other one.
John Gant. Oh my goodness.
But I think he did some openers too. So I don't even know if that's really a fair.
Interesting.
But those are the only 2 guys since 2021.
You made me viscerally angry when you said John Gant. I don't know why.
And then the crazier thing too is so they've only had 4 guys. So Jack Flaherty, John Gant, Andre Palante, and Dakota Hudson, who've made more than 10 starts with a lower than a 5 ERA from within. Everyone else has been above 5. And so it's like the bar here is extremely low to be a competent back of the rotation developed pitcher. So if Michael McGreevy can be a 4.5 ERA guy next year for them and make 28 starts or whatever, like that is major improvement. And okay, sure, you could pay up and get a guy that's a 4.1 or 4 ERA, but then you're paying $15 million a year for that guy. If you can pay the league minimum for a couple guys at the back of your rotation, I think it frees you up to use money in different ways. So that's something I'm starting to keep my eye on. But also, all this is a grain of salt. We've seen one McGreevy start. I think Palante's safe to say now we've enough of a sample size that he's reliable. But everyone else, Graceffo, Liberatore, Kloffenstein, those guys, you're baking in some let's see there. So it's not a full hey, this is the route they should go. But I mean, you go back to middle of June or just the way John Mozeliak has talked about the AAA arms this year. It's been those guys just are not relevant to me. And I don't think that's completely true at this point. I think there's maybe some light shining through, and you give them an off season as well. I'm interested to see what 2025 could look like pitching depth wise. I'm not going to try and act like Palante and McGreevy are middle of the rotation frontline starters, but I do think there's extreme value in having a guy that can slot in the 5 slot, 4 slot, or even just the 6, 7 slots that hey, if we have Kyle Gibson go down for a month and a half, McGreevy can slot in there and we'll be fine.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that?
Well, the McGreevy part's very interesting to me because I kind of comped him to Dakota Hudson. For a while, Dakota Hudson was viable, right? It's not always the way that he got there that made you feel very good about it, but he had a season of a 3.3 some odd ERA, and that was in the rotation. So, and that was pre-Tommy John, where I think his stuff just was not the same, didn't have the same life after the surgery. One of the rare exceptions to seeing guys, they get the surgery all the time and they come back just fine. And I don't think in his case he really did have the same juice to him, but the start that he gave, it's just one start, but I think it put him on the radar in a way that he wasn't for the Cardinals before. They were so reluctant to eventually give him that chance. And I did sort of wonder openly throughout the season, look at all these guys at AAA. Their numbers aren't great there, but can they get a boost moving to the big leagues, as crazy as it sounds, from what their performance is in AAA because of the strike zone differences and no ABS and just the notion of I'm not toiling away anymore. Now I've made it and let's go grind. Yeah. I think there could be something to that. Do I think that it's a sensible, would I like to peg Michael McGreevy for a 3.95 ERA for a full season? I wouldn't do that, but it doesn't mean I'm not ready to see him prove the public wrong, because I've always been a little bit more inclined to like McGreevy. Even from the night he was drafted, people said, oh my gosh, he's got no stuff. He's a strike thrower and Dave Duncan's not here anymore. What's the point? And I'm like, dude, it's his draft night. This is a guy who's having his dream come true as a first round pick. I don't like to lean into like hating on it. And like, if that makes my evaluation lesser, then fine. But sometimes we react to things so negatively, and then the guy comes out and it's like, looked pretty good to me, and like has the Palante factor to him that's like when he carries himself on the mound as a starter, he means it. He means business. That sounds like such bad analysis, and it's not going to fly for the crowd that really gets into that type of stuff in the data. But then again, his stuff plus rated really well in the start. So I'm not ready to bury Michael McGreevy because we maybe haven't seen the best of him yet. I'm willing to consider that he could be a back end of the rotation guy and not just a middle reliever who kicks around for a while in the big leagues. Let's kind of see. But you're right. You do feel better about your depth if he's your seventh, in the same way that you feel better about Palante going into a spring training as your sixth. I'm fine with Palante being in this rotation. I've stumped for him to stay in it the rest of the year. I also believe that if you want to upgrade it from like a middle of the pack rotation to being a top 10 one, adding a Fetty helps. A good version of Sonny Gray helps that. Realizing that you shouldn't go into next year as Steven Matz being one of your five helps that. If he's just part of the group that goes into spring and you don't really have a defined role for him, but you're looking to trade him, or you'd shove him in the bullpen if you had to as an expensive arm, I just think it's better to not be counting on him as your five. If you put him into that group, he's your five and Palante's your six, and you go into spring with somewhat of a competition and maybe the Matt's money. Normally money wins out in those things, but maybe this time it wouldn't be the case. But I would take it a step further and say, Mo, you had to go get 3 starters last offseason, and that was, you were able to do it, but it was like you had to sort of do it in some creative ways of who lives in St. Louis, who wants to be here, who could take an Uber and be here in an hour. Like there were sort of those stipulations that it worked out, right? It ended up being okay, and I think the Cardinals are going to get through okay, especially now with Fetty. But then maybe next year it's a benefit to say, we've only got one spot to fill. Let's be aggressive and see the way that we can do it creatively. I don't know if it's Evaldi. I like Evaldi. I wonder if they're going to be willing to spend. I'm very curious to see what they're going to say openly about payroll after the season if they decide to do an end-of-season press conference this year, unlike last year. Because last year and into the spring, we were hearing, oh, we've got more muscle, we've got flexibility, we can add payroll at the deadline. And then the reports coming out that was not the case. Mo refuted and saying there wasn't any stipulation on him. I don't know if I buy that. I think I'm more inclined to believe the reports that came out from people that you trust to say that the ownership didn't really want to expand payroll at this deadline the way that it was said back in January that they were going to be willing potentially to do. So that's something that I wonder about. Could this be the offseason where they just say, look, we've got one spot to fill. We don't have to fill it, which allows us to then maybe think about only doing it via a big time trade. And you might give one of those pitching prospects that if you're not even guaranteed to count on them until 2026, and even then you're a little bit skeptical of trying to put that pressure on, maybe you trade one of those guys with a Gorman or with another position player that feels, extraneous at this point in time, and you get a guy that's a 2, and suddenly Fetty is your 3, and you're not paying that guy a bunch of payroll because you didn't sign him as a free agent. Maybe that's the world in which the Cardinals approach it this offseason. Is that the year we see a trade, or is it just we got to stop talking about this because the Cardinals don't make those types of deals?
Well, I wonder too. I don't know if it necessarily requires them to be going into the $200 million payroll range to do that either, because you do have the Goldschmidt money coming off. You do have arbitration every year. Always people always forget you're giving raises to guys, that factors in. Gray's contract goes up a little bit, but I think in my scenario, I'm thinking like if you can get creative, which is John Mozeliak even the guy making the decisions this offseason? We'll see, So like, is it a Chaim Bloom show? But like, if you can move the Matt's money, if you don't pick up that Lynn option, that's like 24. Let's be conservative. It's like $20 million you freed up right there. You free up 24 million from Goldschmidt, but you pay Sonny Gray 10 million more, so that's like 30 million, and then you've got to pay arbitrations and stuff. So that number does go down quick, but I don't know. Is there a way where you can move some money around and you're like, your one move, instead of going out and making a lot of smaller moves, your one move is, hey, we've got all this depth this time that we kind of trust. And again, if 4 of the rotation guys go down, any team's going to be impacted like that. Unless you're the Dodgers, the Cardinals are not going to be able to sustain that. But if you can convince yourself that Gray, Fetty, Gibson, Michaelis, plus this next shiny starter that's a number 2 on a shorter contract, I just throw Eovaldi out there as like a placeholder name, as like a 2-year contract guy.
Yeah.
And then you've got Palante, McGreevy, Graceffo, Liberatore behind them. And I'm purposely not mentioning Tink Hence, Quinn Matthews, because I'm like, those are icing on the cake of like a shot in the arm that could come midseason. Let's not even throw them in the conversation as the guys they have to rely on. Is this the offseason where they could say, hey, instead of we have to fill all these random needs that we need, we feel pretty good about our club. So we're going to kind of go in on one guy and call it an off season
Yeah.
and see what the impact could be there. Now, is that what they're going to do? I'm not going to sit here and say this is the direction they're going in, but as I'm kind of armchair GMing right here, it makes sense to, if this is the offseason, to go and do something without even having to talk about moving payroll up. Now, again, I don't know what the exact numbers are. I don't know what the arbitration raises are going to be. I don't know if they're going to feel like they need 2 more bullpen arms or not. So there's a lot of stuff like that that's kind of up in the air. But it's, at the very least, even if they don't go add other arms, I feel pretty, based on where I was a month ago on this Cardinals pitching depth, I feel a little bit more secure in it than I did before, and I think it helps the club long term.
Yeah, and your mention of maybe not having as many holes on the rest of the roster, there's a world in which you let Goldie walk. Burleson's played some first, not as much as people think, but I think he could probably make that move to first base, and the bat mostly is going to justify that. Before I was like, well, is he going to hit well enough to play first? But I think he probably could. By then, I mean, we should be talking about Jordan Walker and having a spot in the outfield for next year. Obviously, we know that there's a lot that goes into that, but that's sort of something that is in the back of my mind. And honestly, if you talk about, well, if Walker can't do it, what do you do? At this point, I don't think it's crazy to say Tommy Pham gets a 1 year, $5, $6, $7 million deal, and you just run it back if things continue to go well for him, and he can sort of be in the same role again next year, which then again does open you up to being willing to just focus on a couple of isolated spots. You're always going to want to do some bullpen stuff. I'll be curious to see one of the pieces of money you didn't mention, Keenan Middleton. I would honestly bring it back on the option based on everything we're hearing about him behind the scenes. If he's healthy enough to pitch, I don't care if he's a middle reliever. I almost think he's like a nice, expensive coach for you that also could be a big part of the bullpen that they were hoping he would be this year. Obviously, he has to come through his rehab from surgery well from the flexor tendon stuff, but he was apparently out there watching McGreevy warm up the other day and like having his hand in that. So that's the kind of stuff that happens behind the scenes that they got to buy him out anyway if they don't. Otherwise, $6 million. I mean, maybe that is something that you willingly pick up and don't make as many bullpen moves in the offseason if he can kind of be that one for you. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting things that I think you could look into. The one part I want to mention that I didn't yet is if Palante goes into spring as your 6, he's probably your 5 because somebody gets hurt in spring. Yeah. And that's okay. Like, that's the way that I think it actually works to bake in because he doesn't make as much money. He's going to be the low man on the totem pole, which isn't fair. But I also could see a world in which it works out just fine for him. Just way it did this week with Lance Lynn getting injured and stuff happens. So that's the kind of depth that makes sense that I think because of the way they were paying so many starters last year, you could have done it. They probably should have done it going into this season, but I understand why they were unwilling because they were like, well, we're still counting on Steven Matz. Well, now I think we've learned your lesson and you don't count on Steven Matz in the same way. And that could be something that benefits you. And anything you get from him is a bonus. He did throw a couple of innings last night for Memphis. We shall see what that brings. Yeah. But I think that's a good place to cut it off, Josh. Any parting thoughts on where we're at, where the Cardinals are at right now as we wrap up episode 3 of Philosophical Differences?
No, I think you hit the one thing I was saying, keep an eye on. It's like, what are they going to do with Matz and Riley O'Brien here soon? Because their rehab assignments will be coming up. And so you got to add them back to the 40-man roster. So what does that mean for like a Ryan Ludis, a Kaufenstein, like, or one of these guys? I mean, someone's going to have to lose their spot because they're not going to drop Matz's money. I don't see them dropping O'Brien. So I think you can see some roster moves here soon. And then how do they construct the bullpen? Does Matz go into the bullpen? Do they let him start again? I think that would be weird. So it'll be interesting to see how they navigate that.
Appreciate it. Agree with you. All right, Josh, that'll do it. Follow Josh on all the socials. You see his username below, Josh Jaco98. I'm at b-schaeff12 on Twitter. Follow Dealing the Cards on YouTube. They've got a TikTok that they do a lot of good stuff with. And make sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel, Brenden Schaeffer, St. Louis Cardinals writer, as well as the B-Shape Daily Podcast feed, so you don't miss anything going forward. For Josh, I'm Brenden. We're done for now. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to you next time on the show. Peace.